Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, July 2nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Vice President Harris and a question that has been posed to many Democrats this evening and earlier on today. Would Vice President Harris be a better replacement for President Biden than any other Democrat? And would she be better than President Biden himself? With recent calls from some top Democratic lawmakers and major Democrats across the party for President Biden to step aside and allow somebody like Vice President Harris, or potentially even weighing an open convention to allow Democratic senators and representatives and governors to put their foot in the door and potentially run for president, have really started emerging. And with all of this conversation around it, it begs the question, does President Biden have an alternative? And if it is an alternative, is it President or Vice President Harris? And what does that mean for the 2024 election? And so I know I just threw a bunch of questions at you, and we are looking at this from a very high-level lens of, in a hypothetical scenario. Right now, it does not look like at all that President Biden is likely to drop out of the race and be replaced by anybody who is even being discussed. Vice President Harris herself says that Joe Biden is our nominee in reference to the Democratic Party, rejecting any lawmaker calls for her to step up ahead and become the presidential nominee. It's a decision that seems to be made from the Biden administration, but also many high-level Democrats that are reiterating today and yesterday that Joe Biden is, of course, the Democratic nominee for president, and that simply isn't going to change. The Biden campaign has been adamant that President Biden will not be stepping down, and so a lot of this really just is hyper-speculation, largely coming from political pundits and the campaign media and staffers, but in the general world of things, it very much looks like President Biden is not going to be replaced by Vice President Harris. But for the sake of exploration and our discussion about it, let's go ahead and take a look at a possible scenario between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump here. It's not going to be an election prediction, but rather an analysis on multiple fronts about where Kamala Harris might provide some advantage and where she ultimately provides some detriment to a campaign like the 2024 one that we've seen from the Biden-Harris team. Now, earlier on today, I released my July 2024 election prediction between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, with Donald Trump winning 312 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 226. The race, quite frankly, is a Republican advantage at this point in time. Republicans have the advantage when it comes down to the Senate, largely now potentially in the House, but very much so on the presidential margin. It looks like Donald Trump would have his largest margin of victory, even larger than 2016. And so 312 to 226 does also call into question, where would Kamala Harris do better? This is probably one of the lowest parts Democrats could be at in the 2024 election. They probably aren't, no matter what, going to lose states like Virginia, Minnesota, New Mexico, New Hampshire, even if they do win them by narrow margins. And so really, this is probably one of the worst case scenarios the Democrats could move forward with. And a new poll today shows Joe Biden losing to Donald Trump, according to CNN, by 6 points across the country. Now, granted, that's larger than what we've seen on the national average. Since the debate, we've seen roughly a 3 to 4 point advantage for Donald Trump, up from the overall 1 to 2 point advantage that he had in the weeks leading up to the debate. But CNN's 6-point poll actually showed a huge contrast with head-to-head numbers between Vice President Harris and President Trump. Vice President Harris ends up losing to Donald Trump by 2 points to Joe Biden's 6-point loss. It's a 4-point improvement for what would be the Democratic nominee for president here, and one that comes at a surprise to many people, but seemingly in line with what we've seen over the past couple of weeks. Now, Kamala Harris hasn't always been floated as this potential nominee against Trump, except for late 2022, early 2023, and then very few and far in between polls that we've seen conducted questions about whether or not Harris is the better option than Trump on the national level. And largely speaking, Trump has been demolishing Kamala Harris when it comes down to head-to-head matchups. The first poll we saw was from 2021, where Trump was leading by 13. Then Trump was leading by 9, then 10, then she led in a poll. And then it was 12 and 11 and 6, and then she led in a poll. And really, you saw the same polling firm, the Federalist and Susquehanna University, come forward with a poll that shows her ahead. At one point, they had her up by 15 points. I'm telling you now, I don't trust numbers like those. But generally speaking, more people started gauging it. Fox News, then Emerson, Harvard Harris, Yahoo News. Consistently here, Trump was in the lead. And even now, most recently, in the 3 recent polls, Reuters, Ipsos, CNN data for progress, Trump +3, Trump +2, Trump +1. Trump does beat Harris, according to some of the recent numbers here. But what compared to President Biden, actually performs slightly better. The overall average here, especially post-debate, is marginally better, by 1 to 2 points. But let's take a look back at that electoral map. 1 to 2 points could make all the difference. Donald Trump being ahead 312 to Joe Biden's 226 means that Democrats need to win a lot more swing states than what they already have in order to win this election. So it would come down to states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, which are tilt Republican states right now, that with a 1 to 2 point advantage, maybe Vice President Harris would be able to make an impact there. But it does call into question, even though she might be making improvements on the national level, where do we actually see her base do well? Well, according to the CNN poll, primarily amongst minority Americans. Kamala Harris does more inspiring and does drive out minority Americans to a higher degree to make them more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. I believe the CNN number here was that Biden won them by 21 and Kamala Harris wins them by 29. Point being, Kamala Harris has sections of the party that she excites more than President Biden does presently. The question is, though, that even though she's losing to Donald Trump, does she still have the opportunity to build it up? She's losing the same way that President Biden is, but a lot of Democrats seem to be confident, or not necessarily confident, but more idealistic, that Joe Biden could recover in time for the election. Could Kamala Harris recover? A lot of Democrats seem to believe that she has this ceiling, that even though she might be polling better, she has the less likely chance of victory than Joe Biden does, even if things look grim right now. And in a way, I see both sides of things. I think on one end, Kamala Harris would stand to be a strong candidate for president. The question is this enough time? We're 4 months and 3 days out from Election Day. Is this enough time for Vice President Harris to be moved up, to be what would be essentially the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party and campaign to win back that base? The problem here on that argument is that Joe Biden has had stronger support than where he is right now. A huge decline in support since that debate, which insinuates that at some point it could be built back up because Trump also experienced a decline. It's not a perfect science, and it certainly doesn't explain everything about where we are right now, but I think it does show that there has been just a general discontent for the national Democrats, national Republicans, Donald Trump and Joe Biden included, that maybe Vice President Harris would be able to build up. Now, Democrats are looking at this too from a lens of, who has the endorsements? And would Harris be able to carry that level of endorsements over the finish line? Meaning, does she bring over those, anti-Trump Republicans? Does she bring over those independent politicians? Does she bring over all of those Democrats and build this coalition that was the winning coalition from 2020? Well, first things first, she can't do that without money. There is no situation in which any Democratic nominee can win this race given the amount of money that Donald Trump has raised without excessive amounts of funds. But that's a good thing for Kamala Harris because based on campaign finance laws, she gets all the money. She gets everything should Joe Biden decide to pull out. Different than what would happen if somebody like Governor Josh Shapiro was nominated. Governor Gretchen Whitmer was nominated. That would be a problem. And so she has the backing from people like Jim Clyburn who say, Kamala Harris, absolutely, I would support her if she ends up being the Democratic nominee for president here. And it seems to be that she is the one who is mentioned countlessly, the one who is in direct speculation because she is the vice president. With money on her side and the endorsements as well, there is a possibility that she does outperform President Biden. But it really is a risky game here. I'm of the perspective that I do not have a concrete answer as to what the Democratic Party could do or should do. I think that there are multiple ways to look at this, but as of right now, there are high risks with nominating Kamala Harris. But there also is a very high reward. It isn't just Kamala Harris who does better than Joe Biden in a head-to-head matchup. Gavin Newsom loses by a point less. Pete Buttigieg loses by 2 points less. Gretchen Whitmer loses by a point less. But they all still lose. And that's the problem. None of this is a proven science that have any of these Democrats be subbed in any way, outside of their home states and some regional advantages in the Midwest, that they would be able to easily win this election. Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that race we have sort of known for roughly 4 years now. And to switch it up on the average American in the last 4 months also poses a significant threat. That voters are confused. And also, that Republicans put up enough of a legal fight that those tens of millions of dollars, that hundreds of millions of dollars that would move over to somebody like Kamala Harris would be spent on legal fees and combating this, voter misinformation or voter disinformation problem that Democrats would have if she was subbed out. Because I can guarantee you, Republicans won't let that happen easily. This won't be all of a sudden Joe Biden making an announcement on the 4th of July saying, I'm going to go ahead and step back, Kamala Harris will take my spot, and everything set in stone. There was going to be immense backlash from the Republican Party, immense backlash even from independents and Democrats. This could very well backfire, and nobody's looking at it right now because everybody's saying Biden is too old. But then they're looking at it from another lens and saying, but he still needs to be the nominee. That's a considerable portion of this country. A considerable portion of Democrats still want Biden to be renominated. A considerable portion of Democrats turned out to vote for him in the primary. And many of them may feel entirely disillusioned with the electoral system if all of a sudden the DNC arbitrarily decided to sub one in for sub one out. And so that would be a problem for the National Democratic Party. That would be a problem for somebody like Vice President Harris, and that could serve to her detriment. This election is important for Democrats. It's not, in fact, probably one of the most important elections that they've had in a very, very long time. And so everything for them needs to go right. Right now, things are not going right. And so they're questioning, is there something we can radically change about this election to make things go right? But I don't know if there is a right answer. Kamala Harris has many reasons that she should be nominated to be the president of the United States to run on the Democratic ticket, whether now or in 2028. But there are serious concerns on the Democratic side that if she gets up there, could something else happen? Could this become now a referendum on a Biden-Harris administration and you're back at where you started? Does Harris have more baggage than Biden that has been hidden and shoved away by the fact that she is the vice president? There are serious, real concerns that Democrats could and should have if they decide to swap out President Biden with anybody else. President Biden is one of the most vetted people in the country. He's ran for president 3 times. He has a track record that goes to show a far wide Senate record, vice presidential record, presidential campaign record. Joe Biden has a lot of baggage, but a lot of it has been cleared and okayed by voters in the past, few years. That cannot be said about Kamala Harris. And I get it. She's vice president. She's vetted too. She has a lot of this, but I will say things are a lot more important when you're the person at the top of the ticket. People very often look to the presidential person as the person they're voting for. Not many Republicans were out there saying, I'm all in for Trump because it's Mike Pence. There was a couple, and it matters on the margins. But on the overall net, they were there for Trump. Same thing for Biden in this election. That's something to keep in mind. And so, while I don't have this perfect answer for you as to whether or not Kamala Harris would be this mega beneficiary, I think hailing from the state of California, 54 electoral votes, Democrats were going to win it anyway, maybe some West Coast advantage points, but even then, I just don't really see that much shifting away from what is already characterized as a Republican state. I do think, though, that what I believe to be true is this. If the election was held today, Kamala Harris would probably do better than President Biden. At the same time, who has a higher chance of victory this coming November? Part of me believes it is President Biden, because he's someone who has already won against Donald Trump. Kamala Harris is not, at least not in the sense that she was at the nominating ticket. She was not the presidential candidate there. There is a serious question, too. Does what we look at today really matter? All of this conversation from those Congress people who are quietly murmuring to Politico about President Biden's ineffectiveness at being a Democratic nominee, and many of the other Democratic staffers and people who are talking about it now, looking at this debate as the end-all be-all for the nomination process, end-all be-all for this presidential election, maybe it won't actually matter as much as the media is sensationalizing it to mean, as much as we are talking about it on election Twitter, as much as this is being brought up. The average American isn't as tuned in as you might think. The average voter is not as tuned in as you might think. And these conversations and calls for Biden to step down and take a step away from the presidency are actually quite insular, a lot more than we think. And that isn't to say that the American public doesn't agree with the sentiment, but to be actively thinking about it, to be actively discussing who would be replacing President Biden, that isn't everyday conversation. That's not the conversation happening at everybody's dinner table tonight. And that's a good thing for President Biden. But in the overall net, I think that there are many risks and many rewards with nominating Kamala Harris to be the presidential ticket. I think of any Democrat, she has to be the one. She's the only one that will comply with ballot laws, the only one who could comply with financial proceedings. There are so many reasons you would have to go with Vice President Harris. She'd be the only one. No one else would dare put themselves in the ring. I do think on the last part here, the only way I really could see a major benefit to a Kamala Harris presidency for her being, moved up to be the presidential nominee is who she chooses as VP. There is an extensive bench of Democrats there that could, in theory, take on that role. Who I'm thinking about are people like Josh Shapiro from 2022 who won in Pennsylvania by 15. People like Tony Evers who won in Wisconsin by 3. People like Tim Walz who won in Minnesota by 8. Many different people across the country. I mean, we're not just extending to the governorships here. We could go to the Senate. We could go to the House. There are many people who pull in regional advantages electability advantages, multiple different ways to look at this from the lens of who would provide most of the ticket. And there is a possibility that somebody could tackle onto Vice President Harris's ticket for her to be the next president and actually help her carry that across the finish line. Because right now, all America has known is Biden and Harris. When you take out Biden in this scenario, allow somebody else to move in. Allow somebody else to be Harris and Buttigieg or Harris and Shapiro or Harris and Whitmer, whatever way we decide to go about it, whatever way they decide to move forward with it, if that was the circumstance. And that could be the true biggest help. But there are a lot of risks. A lot of rewards, so many different ways to look at this, so many different ways to crack at it. I wouldn't say it's a coin toss, but it feels a lot like one, and it's a very interesting election, a very close one, or so it seems. Could end up being closer than it actually is, but right now it seems like Donald Trump has the advantage, and Democrats are wondering what's next for our party nominee. To replace him with Vice President Harris or not? And while I don't have a concrete answer, I think time will tell what Democrats decide to do and what their own internal numbers might suggest to do, and what they actually do will be decided in just around a month, because the convention is in less than 2 months. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.